We're up against it very much in Afghanistan at the moment with the ISAF deployment there, and of course in terms of the operations over the border from Pakistan. And of course, it's also something that we have to understand and monitor, even if at the end of the day, other organisations, such as the European Union, with its work on arrest warrants and passenger manifest lists and so on, may be more at the front end than NATO. So what I want to give you today, if you will allow me, in the 20 minutes or so that Maram has allotted, is my own personal sort of perspective, not necessarily a NATO perspective, on where we are in dealing with this threat of Islamist extremist terrorism. And what we have learned along the way in terms of how we can fight it more effectively. Now, anybody who deals with this, ladies and gentlemen, right from the beginning, has to make an operational distinction between war on terrorists and war on terrorism. Because obviously it's no good, simply as General Petraeus, I think, has pointed out on many occasions, it's useful but not in itself sufficient simply to kill terrorist leaders and commanders when there are always plenty to take their place. Do you remember the famous phrase that was used by a former CIA director about this some years ago, that you kill the mosquitoes best of all by draining the swamp? So while naturally those operations have to go ahead, and I'll say more about those in a moment, we also have to be mindful of trying to understand better what produces a terrorist. Javier Solana in this town for many years used to say quite rightly that people are not born terrorists, at least most of them are not, they become terrorists. So why? What motivates them to become terrorists? Is it really religious belief? I don't think so. I'll say more about this in a moment. Or is it other factors? And if we understand better what drives people into this form of nihilist extremism, how can we do a better job of persuading them to quit through rehabilitation programs? So I'd like, if you allow me, to spend some minutes on dealing with terrorists and then some minutes on what we have learned about the dealing with terrorism as a phenomenon. Now, the first thing, of course, particularly if we look at Al-Qaeda as the emblem of international jihadist terrorism, the first thing is that there has been a regional dispersal. A few years ago, the focus was essentially on Afghanistan, whence 9/11 came. But everybody who deals with this speaks about the Al-Qaeda franchise, that rather like McDonald's, this is an organization which is very good at establishing or authorizing branches around the globe. And of course, this is an organization which is highly flexible in terms of relocating when the pressure is on in one place, easily to another place. The World Bank calculates that there are 65 failing or failed states in the world today. That's about 1/3 of the global community. So there's obviously no shortage of alternative locations when the heat is on in places such as Iraq or Afghanistan. That said, from a NATO perspective, clearly for us, the problem today is first and foremost on the Afghan-Pakistani border. The experience that we've gained so far is that Al-Qaeda works best not as a solitary organization, but as a parasite, where it can infiltrate and latch on to extremist organizations which already have a firm grounding in a given country, such as, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan or in the northern provinces of Pakistan. The Al-Qaeda can offer them money, it can offer them foreign recruitment, particularly as their own national numbers decline, but they in return can offer clearly protection, safe areas and foot soldiers. And today, I think for us, the overwhelming focus is on the province of North Waziristan, where we believe Osama bin Laden and al-Zawahiri, his deputy, are currently located. We've had some considerable success. And I'll have the same to say about Iraq and other places. The United States calculates that its drones have been responsible for decimating including about 2/3 of the existing Al-Qaeda Taliban high command on the frontier between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Virtually no week goes by without some new news of leaders have been taken out. And congratulations to the United States. It's not been easy, but I think the US can also claim some success in having engaged the Pakistani army in diverting some of its resources and attention away from India towards South Waziristan in particular, taking on directly Taliban and Al-Qaeda elements. I think also one of the things that the Pakistanis are now better at doing is dividing them by, for example, arresting some. You've seen this in recent weeks in Lahore and Karachi, in order to try to tempt them into negotiations with Pakistan and with and the Afghans as well. This is good in terms of creating suspicion within the movement that some may be prepared to sell out and to reconcile to the Americans or to Afghanistan. In fact, the Pakistanis have lost nearly 2,000 of their own troops in this effort, so it's not been cost-free for them. But there are problems which we face in Afghanistan, Pakistan. The first one is, can we persuade the Pakistanis to take on the Afghan Taliban? Ironically, this may sound very counterintuitive, ladies and gentlemen, but the Pakistanis seem more willing to take on the domestic Pakistani Taliban, which they see directly as a threat to the state. They're less willing to take on the Afghan Taliban because I think some elements in Pakistan, particularly the intelligence community, the ISI, still believes that these people could be part of some kind of post-US arrangement in Afghanistan, where, of course, they would definitely represent the interests of Pakistan against the interests of India. So we still have some work to do in persuading the Pakistanis that they can't conveniently divide between one type of extremist threat that can be useful and another type of extremist threat which is a direct threat to them. So that's one particular job. The second particular job, of course, is, and we're discovering this every day in Afghanistan, but the Pakistanis are discovering it too, there's not much sense in cleaning out Al-Qaeda or the Taliban from a certain area and they eventually trickle back later, rather like whack-a-mole. You know whack-a-mole? You play whack-a-mole, you know, you hit it on the head in an area and it pops up somewhere else. And for example, the Pakistanis conducted a very brave operation to clear out the Al-Qaeda Taliban elements from the Swat Valley, but there's a lot of evidence that many of these people have infiltrated back. Another problem, of course, is the justice system. Pakistan has been very good at arresting suspected militants. Their jails are full of about 2,500 of these individuals at the moment, but the absence of a credible criminal justice system means that after a period they have no option but to let these people go. I'll have more to say about Pakistan in a moment, but that is one of the focus points. On the other hand, what is worrying is that there is evidence that Al-Qaeda is now relocating to other areas. Now, one of the things that you always have to look at in this respect is organised crime. The strange thing is that even Somalia was too fouled for Al-Qaeda. Yes, yes. It has to go to places where there is at least some kind of functioning state that can provide some kind of protection, or there is at least organised criminal activities, drugs, for example, people trafficking, weapons trafficking in particular, because much of the Al-Qaeda is in fact financed from organised criminal activities. There is, and many of the recruits, by the way, into the jihadist movements have an organised criminal background. For example, the Saudis have calculated that 25% of all of the Saudi jihadists have a criminal record, which I think is quite interesting. So where you see, for example, drug flows or organised crime flows, you will soon see Al-Qaeda as well. So one focal point now clearly for us is Africa. Sahara first and foremost, because that provides a large protective waste. But on the other hand, it's very positive that just a few days ago, 4 countries in this area, Algeria, Mali, Mauritania and Niger, agreed to set up a joint command supported by the United States to deal with some of these criminal activities, the kidnappings and terrorist presence. Second area, of course, is Yemen. You saw yesterday that there was an attack against the British ambassador in Sana'a. And, of course, the Nigerian, you remember, underpants bomber on Christmas Day came from Yemen. Again, it's no surprise that Al-Qaeda should be interested in Yemen, where, incidentally, two-thirds of the attackers on 9/11 had their origins. It's no surprise because, again, you find in Yemen this presence of organised extremist movements fighting nationalist causes, which, again, this parasitical organisation can integrate into. Despite what I said earlier, Somalia is also somewhere where we have to keep a close eye because the Al-Shabaab Islamic courts movement is again something which can provide a structure around which Al-Qaeda can organise. On the other hand, all is not gloomy. In two places, the international community has had enormous success. One is Iraq, where the United States, by turning the Sunni insurgency, you remember, into the awakening movement on the side of the United States, has had enormous success in decimating the Al-Qaeda leadership. Two of the elements, al-Masri and al-Baghdadi, were in fact killed by American forces just a few days ago. Over the last 2 years, over 300 Al-Qaeda elements in Iraq have been either killed or captured by the US forces, and although we still have car bombs, of course, in Iraq, at least it's seen today that Al-Qaeda has very little footprint in Iraq now, whereas it used to be extremely strong. In fact, Michael Hayden, former director of the CIA, has spoken of the strategic defeat of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Another success story is Indonesia, where the Indonesians, with a lot of support from Australia and the United States, have had enormous success against the Islamiyah Jemaah movement. The leader who planned the Bali bombings, Nordin Mohammed Top, was recently killed in an operation against his hideout. And I'm not saying that this hideout is not going to be recreated, but at least for the time being, there has been some success. So if we look at the first part, which is dealing with terrorists, what do we find? That obviously, we are having some success in intelligence terms at identifying and in taking out the major leaders. This doesn't mean to say that others don't take their place, but number one, there is a lull. It can be months before an effective new leader emerges. Number two, the pressure on these movements means that although they can have some local impact, it's much more difficult for them to carry out spectaculars. We haven't had a spectacular attack in either Europe or the United States since 2005, although we have had obviously some near spectacular operations which were prevented. And what we've discovered, and I think the underpants bomber on Christmas Day is a sign that Al-Qaeda not being able any longer to carry out these highly organised, well-structured, multiple attacks is increasingly relying upon persuading one individual to have a go, you know, the shoe bomber, the pants bomber, have a go in the hope that if he gets through the net and is successful, this thing which is financed very cheaply, for example, the bombers in London on 2005 who came from within the British system, weren't even known to the police before it happened, did it all with a £10,000 bank loan. If it works, you know, it has some impact. It shows that the organisation is still alive and kicking. So we are keeping them on the run. This means that Al-Qaeda is evolving in 5 particular ways from 9/11. The first way is what I call death by 1,000 cuts. In other words, the fewer attacks that you're actually able to carry out, the more you talk about attacks, the more you bog down the security services with data overload, you know, internet sites, emails, blogs and all of that, to permanently sort of bewilder us. So we're constantly, you know, focusing on a million things at once, information overload, in hope that, rather like our bomber friend, Pants bomber, the Nigerian, on Christmas Day, a glitch occurs in the system. You know, his father denounces him to the US Embassy, it's passed on, but it doesn't reach the dots are not connected, as we say. So in other words, get people through overwhelming us with potential misinformation. Secondly, economic warfare. you don't have to have read Joe Stiglitz and the $1 trillion war to have seen that an attack on 9/11, which cost about $250,000 to mount, has so far, according to Joe Stiglitz, cost the United States more than $1 trillion to respond to. And Stiglitz, in fact, in the latest edition, calculates that this will go up to $3 trillion by the end. Bin Laden, to the extent that he still speaks, puts the emphasis more and more on economic warfare, or at least trying to take credit amongst his own supporters for the financial crisis. This is similar to Khrushchev's "we will bury you" threat to Kennedy at the time of the Cold War. In other words, by, again, keeping up the constant drone of possible attacks, keeping us on alert, making us improve air security, introduce body lasers, put more and more barricades around our buildings. This may be completely illusory, but Al-Qaeda generally believes that they can vastly increase the cost of protection to us. Third, create divisions amongst the Western partners. Who, if you look at Iraq, who are the Taliban now targeting? The answer is the Germans. 45 of them have been killed, just 7 last week. The Italians, the Spanish, because their perception is that these are the weak links in the NATO coalition. You know, the Dutch have now said that they are leaving Afghanistan. Canada is going to do so next year. This is nothing to do, by the way, with Al-Qaeda and terrorism. These departures have long been announced. But there is a perception that if you can just go after the weak links, the countries where public opinion is very much against this kind of operation, if you can force them to quit, then the others in a kind of chain reaction think that it's legitimate to quit as well. The next element is, as I mentioned earlier, finding new failed states to relocate to as bases and therefore to be personally reconfiguring. Now, that is therefore as far as the war on terror. Terrorists is concerned. What about the war on terrorism? Since 9/11, as you all know, the think tank, the intelligence community, the academic community have been researching, thinking, writing as to what can we possibly do to prevent people from wanting to become terrorists in the first place, or what can we do once they have been terrorists to persuade them to give up. What we've discovered, as I've said, is that very, very, very few terrorists actually become terrorists through religious motivation. For example, in the West, a study that the Dutch have done, because the Dutch have had a major problem with parallel societies, on a group called the Hofstad Group, which you may have heard of, which was a group which was active in the Netherlands, shows that only 5% of those radicalized had any kind of religious grounding in the Quran or in the teaching of Islam. One Dutch security officer described it to me as do-it-yourself Islam. It was a little bit picked up from self-appointed preachers who had no qualifications whatever to declare themselves to be imams, no certification, a little bit of internet, done in a night kind of pasted together research. It was a kind of self-indoctrinated philosophy, but which had no bearing in true religion. As one once said, I had the sentence when I suddenly realized later that I had to study the paragraph. That's the first thing. Secondly, that very few people, that there is not one single motivation from become radicalized. Often, in fact, the ideological motivation comes at the end of the process rather than at the beginning of the process. And for example, you may have seen, if you read the Financial Times, which I'm sure you will do, a very interesting study that was reported on by a British think tank called Demos, on radicalism in the UK, which pointed out that for most people it's the equivalent of, you remember the Mods and the Rockers fighting on Brighton Beach, or some of you may, in the 1960s. It's cool to be radical. And they get into it because of peer example, peer group pressure in the community, because it's excitement, or because they certainly may feel radicalized, but the actual desire to become a terrorist comes through much, much later, often when it's too late to retreat, and of course because of group pressure. Very few people, by the way, actually volunteer to become suicide bombers, and many have dropped out at the last minute before committing the act, because clearly indoctrination, peer pressure, not letting the side down, it becomes very important. And therefore one aspect of countering radicalisation is not simply to get community leaders to sort of play a role in the community, or religious leaders in terms of teaching the truth about what the Quran says about jihad and what it doesn't say. That, of course, is important, but we have got to dequalify, if I can use this expression, make it less cool for people to actually become radicals. I'm not saying that we have the answer to this yet. One thing that in the UK, because obviously being British, I know my country best, that we're trying is in fact to have government support. This may strike you as somewhat sort of counterintuitive, but to have government support actually for radical movements. In other words, let people let off steam. If they're protesting against the Middle East, or they're protesting against the US, or they're protesting against NATO, or even offering them to go out to these countries if they feel so passionately about it, in some kind of Islamist peace corps to work there and discovering the realities. So in other words, rather than try to suppress all kinds of radical views, as long as they're not violent, to actually allow people to let off steam, because the alternative, if there isn't that sort of safety valve, is that they're more likely to join radical groups. Now, this doesn't always work, because sometimes we had an organisation called the Quilliam Foundation in the UK, which was designed to do this, but of course once people discovered it was financed by the British government, it lost certain of its credibility. But so that's one. The second thing, of course, is rehabilitation programs. The Saudis have gone very, very far in dealing with the rehabilitation of militants. So far, they have processed, if that's the right word, 4,000 of these. They've had some success. I can't verify the figures, but the Saudis claim that only 10%, so 400, have actually gone back to radical jihadist activities after they have gone through the program. What does the program do? Basically, the program doesn't torture them or waterboard them. It sort of treats them nicely. It tries to find out what they're worried about. For one man, it may be that his family is protected or whatever. They're offered education and so on, motivations in order to rejoin society at a later date. And even the United States in Iraq, with a so-called Task Force 135, is trying to copy some of the Saudi experience of dealing with the issue through co-option rather than through very tough methods. I'm not going to say that these kind of methods will work against the real hardcore the leadership. There, I don't think you have any other alternative but to either arrest them or to kill them. But let's face it, 90% of these individuals are basically foot soldiers who are misguided, people who've fallen on the wrong side of life, and rehabilitation can work. I think at least it's something that we should try. By the way, there is another study, believe it or not, by a British academic called David Wetham, who's at King's College London, who shows that a lot of the of jihadists have suffered sexual abuse. Sexual abuse in madrasas in Pakistan, for example, or symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which suggests that some kind of psychological treatment might also be appropriate. So, let me just conclude with a couple of final thoughts. The first thing is we have to do a better job of winning the war of ideas, because basically the internet is the major recruitment tool, naturally, for jihadists. We have to delegitimize, of course, Al-Qaeda. There we're having some success, by the way. The US Foundation does regular opinion polls, and in countries like, for example, Indonesia or Pakistan, support for Al-Qaeda has basically dropped by 50% over the last few years among Muslims. I don't know if you saw, but there was a very interesting website debate between al-Zawahiri, and Muslims at the end of 2007, where he was really on the defensive, because Muslims pointed out quite rightly that 99% of all of the victims of his attacks are Muslims, not Jews and not Christians, although there are too many of them, but Muslims. This sense that Al-Qaeda, apart from protest, has no viable political strategy, no alternative to offer, I think is going down. So support for Al-Qaeda has dropped considerably. The danger, therefore, and this is a more sober note, ladies and gentlemen, is not that the problem is going to go away, but this sort of radical anger will actually sort of go away from Al-Qaeda as a kind of transnational ideology trying to go back to the 7th century, and instead latch onto more nationalist movements. So it could crop up in more support for Hamas in your area, or the area of Israel, excuse me, more support for Hezbollah, just like we're finding that in places like Pakistan, young radicals, including from the United Kingdom, who go after Pakistan, aren't joining Al-Qaeda anymore. It's not sexy, but they're latching onto other networks like Lashkar-e-Taiba or like, for example, the Haqqani network, and so on. So the drop of support for Al-Qaeda, it isn't necessarily totally positive news. But our real problem is that we're not spending enough time and effort explaining, particularly in the Islamic world, who we are and what we stand for. So definitely improve our strategic communications. Secondly, we've got to stop our hysteria. You may not agree with me, but I'm amused, for example, when we have a situation where a Qatari diplomat on a United Airlines flight says something silly. It's stupid, and he can't be a diplomat if he says something stupid on a plane about a bomb or whatever. But that is not, to my mind, a reason to shut down the entire US traffic system, to impound the plane and the passengers for 48 hours before they're allowed to go. I mean, Osama bin Laden loves this. The idea that one little phrase, and we go into panic overdrive, we stop the world as we know it. In fact, I have a lovely quote from an Israeli expert, Shlomo Dror, who says, the US does not have a security system, it has a system for bothering people. Well, all of us who have travelled, not just in the US, but anywhere, have been bothered. But let's spend all of our time and effort in stopping the underpants bomber joining the dots getting through, instead of having all of our time and effort in, for example, making sure that a wife and a husband and a baby have their pram turned over and their baby powder sniffed and so on. Let I think, focus it where it is. But to end up at the end on four big issues for the future, in shaping the environment in which terrorists are likely to find fertile ground for their beliefs, mistaken as they are. Number one, nuclear terrorism. George Bush rightly said that the worst solution is the worst people getting their hands on the worst weapons. The new proliferators on the block, like Iran and North Korea, are also the countries which have the biggest record of actually exporting missile technologies to other countries. Syria, Libya, of course, recently Saudi Arabia. So they are not only a threat in themselves, but they, of course, are also serial leakers. Nobody knows where this technology could end up. Secondly, I personally do not believe that there is an exact correlation between poverty and terrorism. The 9/11 terrorists, we all know, came from relatively well-to-do families. But, again, lots of studies that have been done do point out to the fact that there is obviously a correlation between unemployment and recruitment, underemployment or unemployment, and terrorist activity. And, of course, increasingly, the terrorist organisations are locating in the poorest countries of the of the world, where the only education available to most families is the madrasa type of schooling. So, although yes, this is not something that we can do overnight, we have got to look at what we can do to develop the economies of the Muslim countries. Most of you, I imagine, have read the UN Development Programme Arab Development Reports. A whole series have come out last year. These show convincingly that the Arab world is much more, less connected to the internet, doesn't empower women, so misses out on well over 50% of the available talent. The demographics in terms of birth rates are higher there. The average age in the Arab world is 22 years, elsewhere 28. Look at Yemen. I've come to the end here because my time is up. But look at Yemen. I mean, 44% of the population of this country is under 15 years of age. For heaven's sake, with no jobs, no oil revenues, declining in environment. So we have to pay some kind of attention, even though the solution is not easy, to what we can do here. Finally, Middle East peace process. I am among those who personally are rather sceptical, Mr. Schneider, that an Arab-Israeli peace process, although highly desirable in itself, would lead to the end of extremism. They would latch on to some other grievance somewhere else. There's no doubt about it. But some senior Americans, like General Petraeus, are on record, as you know, as saying that it would certainly nonetheless assist the US image in this part of the world if there could be progress in this area, and it would certainly do good, even if maybe not be the panacea that everybody hopes.